On Vietnam's western border lies the small, rugged state of Laos. Following its independence in 1954 after the Geneva Convention and France's defeat by the Viet Minh in the First Indochina War, international attention largely turned away from the small landlocked state and towards its much more populous and contentious neighbors, the states of North and South Vietnam. Laos emerged from the post-Geneva period in relative stability compared to its neighbor South Vietnam, which was immediately put on the defensive, firstly from North Vietnamese Army stay-behind forces, which according to the Pentagon Papers included approximately 5,000 to 10,000 men. These stay-behind units, which had not retreated with the rest of the Viet Minh after the ink had dried at Geneva, worked to recruit local peasants to the cause of socialist revolution, growing the insurgency and putting further strain on the South Vietnamese government. These stay-behind forces would officially become the Viet Cong in 1960, a rugged guerrilla organization receiving their marching orders directly from the government in Hanoi, and being constantly reinforced through the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this, my friends, is where Laos comes into focus, at least the war in Laos that we have all heard about. You see, although Laos emerged from the colonial yoke within a short-lived period of peace and tranquility, the small key-shaped country would come to contend with two intrinsically interconnected internal wars within its loosely defined borders, or should I say two theaters of a larger war. These wars were both intrinsic parts of the larger Vietnam War, but they were distinct from each other in a very important way. One war, the counterinsurgency campaign along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the south from 1959 onwards, although illegal under Laos's neutral status and immensely brutal, is discussed to this day by establishment voices and in countless books and journals as an essentially good war, or at least a valiant effort. As the Vietnam War progressed, U.S. Special Forces and local allies were increasingly shuttled into southern Laos on increasingly deadly missions to attempt to mount some sort of counterinsurgency campaign against the swelling Ho Chi Minh Trail. Naturally, this war along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the south remains the stated reason as to why Laos was such a critical geopolitical entity during the U.S.-Vietnam War, as the trail continuously supplied the ongoing insurgency in the US's client state in South Vietnam from 1959 onwards. An insurgency that largely defined the Vietnam conflict as a whole. But it was the second war in Laos, the war in the north, that has largely remained an open secret, but time and time again gets swept under the rug. That war was a secret war at the time, planned and orchestrated by the CIA, and mostly fought by their clients, the mountain-dwelling Hmong people of northeastern Laos. That war, lasting a little over a decade, from roughly 1961 to 1972, led to what Alfred Mccoy terms as the Cold War opium boom, and the increased prominence of Laos within the global narcotics paradigm. That war, the dirty narco-fueled war in Laos's north, would establish the CIA's playbook for their future foreign interventions in Nicaragua and Afghanistan, and would import a new privatized model for global black ops. The profits from this war would come to help fund illegal and corrupt activities across the subcontinent, and eventually across the world in the 1970s and early 80s. And finally, the organizational structure for that war, the executives, operators, paramilitary trainers, pilots, and smugglers, all brought together to plan and execute this unprecedented operation, would remain close colleagues, especially as they would reemerge in the 1980s as the future core of the Iran-Contra group, otherwise known as the Enterprise. Laos was ground zero for the new Central Intelligence Agency, or at least the second iteration of it. An agency that could tap into an endless stream of illicit funds at any time, to conduct paramilitary operations and covert wars across the globe, away from congressional or taxpayer scrutiny, through a newly emergent private intelligence network. Today, and in the next parts of this series, I want to do justice to the history of the secret war in Laos, as it has often unjustly been relegated as simply a sideshow to the greater Vietnam conflict that would erupt in 1964. Although this may be the contention today, it was not always the case. Before 1962, it appeared to U.S. policymakers and the national security establishment that Laos was of primary concern, and also was the most likely candidate for direct U.S. military intervention, not Vietnam. Today we will be exploring the reasons as to why Laos was a major concern to U.S. policymakers before Vietnam, and also begin to answer why it was relegated to the status of a sideshow, and why to this day we still have this contention. During the interwar decade between its independence in 1954 to the beginning of the Vietnam War in 1964, Laos was a powder keg, where conflict could erupt at any moment, to most outside viewers. Today, we enter the powder keg, as I hope to comprehensively and fairly explore how the CIA made Laos their personal fiefdom in the future, wider Second Indochina War.
I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
I want to begin today with some geopolitics, specifically why Laos mattered to Western foreign policy in the region. On paper, Laos should have been fairly insignificant. A small landlocked country with few strategic resources, difficult terrain, and a relatively poor populace. But to a US establishment that had completely committed itself to containing communism in Southeast Asia following the French withdrawal, Laos represented the final necessary piece to counter the communist North Vietnamese efforts at unification. You see, during the decade or so covering the First Indochina War, the US had solidly cemented its place in East Asia through the funding and overt support of several Western-aligned proxies throughout the continent. This collection of states had crystallized into what amounted to a capitalist bloc, countries led usually by strongman governments that acted as a bulwark against the rising communist and socialist movements of the post-war period. As establishment histories tell of the encroachment of communist movements within East Asia, they also often conveniently overlooked the establishment of a counterforce of Western-aligned and funded regimes across the continent during the same period. It all started with Japan, following the end of World War II and the total absorption of the defeated empire into the Western sphere. From there came the Philippines, nominally independent in 1946, but which remained completely attached to their former American colonial overlord. The Philippines, as I covered last time, and as we will see again today, served as a consistent partner for the US mission in Southeast Asia, from providing unaccountable mercenary forces to hosting one of the CIA's premier counterinsurgency academies for up-and-coming guerrilla leaders. Undeniably, counterinsurgency operations in the subcontinent gained additional urgency following the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Consequently, Chiang Kai-shek's regime in Taiwan was established and would serve as an unwavering ally and client to Washington policymakers in the region. It is also incidentally not a coincidence that the CIA's airline, Civil Air Transport, which of course would become Air America in 1959, was formally incorporated and headquartered in Taiwan. It is also no coincidence that some of the most outspoken and influential voices in Washington, D.C., pushing for formal U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia in the post-Geneva conference period, were powerful Taiwanese business interests and U.S. boosters, which formed the newest iteration of the always powerful China lobby. We will illuminate their role and specific motivations in spurring the US's formal entry into Southeast Asia in much more detail in the next part of this series. But for the time being, we must note Taiwan's key position in the US's East Asian axiom. Then, of course, came Thailand, which the US taxpayers would come to cover some 50% of their military spending between 1950 and 1975. This period also marked a continuously rotating cast of strongman military governments in Bangkok, all ready to do Washington's bidding and to engage in cross-border raids and counterinsurgency work into neighboring Laos. Not to mention Thailand's early and prominent role in the narco trade, allowing the dope to flow largely unimpeded by General Pau's border police to the port of Bangkok. As was covered extensively in my video on Operation Paper, the opium from Burma's always warring Shan state was during this period being produced and trafficked by breakaway Chinese nationalist armies, supported for a time in the early 1950s by the CIA under General Lee Mi. Don't worry, Lee Mi's lost army will factor into our story about Laos, as they remained a prominent force in the subcontinent until at least 1970, essentially working as a CIA proxy force in the region. But for now, last but certainly not least was the critical US client state of South Vietnam, which Washington worked immediately to bolster under the controversial and increasingly corrupt regime of the Ngo brothers, as I covered in the last episode of this series. As Washington's most important and simultaneously most difficult proxy in Southeast Asia, South Vietnam was the endpoint, starting in 1959, of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the supply lines of the ongoing insurgency movement in the south through Laos. Coincidentally, Saigon, the capital of the Republic of Vietnam, was also the endpoint of the second route that Lao opium and eventually Burmese opium would take to reach global markets. With both Bangkok and Saigon under de facto Western control, and with opium and later heroin increasingly flowing to both countries, and with both regimes participating covertly in the trade, Laos's opium would become a sort of covert funding source for both of Washington's most critical partners in the soon-to-be Vietnam War. And, as Laos's neutral status continued to impede official U.S. military action in the country, illicit narco-funding would help fill the gap in supporting the war effort of Uncle Sam's chosen anti-communist allies in Laos itself. With a little help from the CIA in the 1960s, opium profits would come to fund the activities of Langley's two primary allies in the Keystone State, the Royal Lao Army and the agency-trained and funded Hmong mercenary army of Vang Pao. Fundamentally, Lao opium profits and increasingly bountiful harvests would allow the CIA to wage a full-on war in Laos without any official on-the-books U.S. military personnel stepping foot in the country. There were, of course, plenty of unaccounted Special Forces members that would operate in Laos, and sure, these could be considered military personnel, but the international community didn't need to know about any of that. To Washington, Laos was the prominent buffer between the US's two major capitalist clients in Thailand and South Vietnam, and the growing forces of North Vietnam and Mao's China in the north. Additionally, the US was constantly looking for ways to quell the increasingly active Ho Chi Minh Trail, running down the eastern border of the country. With that, control of Laos meant control of the South Vietnamese insurgency, which meant success in the war. And since Laos was a neutral country and Congress was unlikely to approve a unilateral mission into the new state, or to avoid international scrutiny, the CIA would be put in charge of the war there starting in about 1961, and would need to fund it themselves. And that's where the opium came into the picture. And by all means, when the fighting really started in Laos, the opium also really started to flow with it. Following the formal independence of the Kingdom of Laos in 1954, the country's political landscape was split into three competing ideologies. These three competing factions would each be led by a minor aristocrat, all three of which were half-brothers, which has led to this period being known as the Period of Three Princes. These three factions, led by the three princes, would also form the three major sides of the upcoming Laos Civil War. Under the new constitutional monarchy, officially established in the last years of French rule, the king held little real power, instead deferring to the parliament, the Royal Lao Army, and the increasingly fractured and chaotic guerrilla groups that began to appear across the country as the true power centers of the nascent state. Within these three areas, the parliament, the Royal Lao Army, and the ongoing guerrilla movements, the three factions of the Kingdom of Laos fought for ultimate control. The first prince, who founded the staunchly anti-communist Rightist Party, originally under the Independent Party but under many different names later, aligning generally with the army and the monarchy, was a man named Boon Um. Although Boon was the de facto founder of Laos's conservative movement, he was simply the political figurehead in Viet Minh, the capital, often overshadowed by strongman army generals who exerted the true force of the Lao right wing in the country's increasingly fractured political arena. The second prince, Prince Supanuvong, often nicknamed the Red Prince, was the figurehead leader of the Lao Patriotic Front, known more commonly as the Pathet Lao, or the Lao Communist Party. The Pathet Lao had been founded in the mid-1940s, initially as a minuscule contingency of the Viet Minh coalition during the early years of Ho Chi Minh's movement. The Pathet Lao were at the time, and would continuously be at a certain level, always reliant on their much more prominent neighbors to maintain strength, and to gain ground in the northeast of the country. Although the Pathet Lao nominally fought alongside the Viet Minh during the First Indochina War against the French, they in reality spent most of the latter years of the war in Laos, building a power base and recruiting comrades in the northeasternmost provinces of Laos, in Sam Nua and Pong Sali. These provinces would form their primary power base into the early years of the Laos Civil War. Now, right before the Geneva Accords were finalized, in July of 1954, the Viet Minh formed a small advisory group in northern Laos known as the Group 100, which would, according to Frederick C. Benson, quote, transform the Pathet Lao into a military and political force that was able to stand on its own 2 feet. but without direct Vietnamese military intervention, end quote. Thus, the Vietnamese Viet Minh at the last second ensured the continuity of a robust communist movement in northern Laos, largely aligned to Hanoi's policy vision. Between 1954 and 1959, the Pathet Lao operated similarly to the two other political factions active in the country, participating in the elections that they were allowed to, and working like the Viet Minh to form a strong political base, especially in the rural, mountainous northeastern provinces. Consequently, as violence would escalate across the newly formed state, and the CIA and Washington power brokers increasingly pressured the Lao neutralist government to consolidate power over the communists in the late 50s, the Pathet Lao would once again take up arms and become a powerful guerrilla movement that would continue to align with their Viet Minh neighbors throughout the upcoming wars. Lastly, in 1954, Laos was the third political faction, the neutralists, who did everything they could to maintain cohesion in their new country. Led by Laos's third prince, the country's first prime minister, Souvanna Phouma, the neutralist Lao National Progress Party, founded in 1950, advocated for Laos's total neutrality in regards to the war surrounding it and the Cold War broadly. In the tradition of other early Cold War Third World leaders, such as Tito of Yugoslavia, Nasser of Egypt, and Nehru of India, Phouma called for Laos to be a non-aligned state during the ongoing Cold War. In its first decade of independence, the Lao neutralist movement was broadly popular amongst the people of Laos, who themselves were predisposed to neutral sentiments, as the majority Buddhist faith called for non-violence and general political neutrality. To the Americans, this neutrality-prone populace with little interest in fighting would continue to act as a roadblock, especially in training and motivating the nascent Royal Lao Army to take up arms against their communist countrymen in the Pathet Lao movement. Nonetheless, the prospect of Lao neutrality became increasingly unrealistic as US and Viet Minh interventions in Laos became more prominent. Consequently, the neutralist movement had largely disappeared by the late 1960s, with most of its rank and file joining either the Royal Lao Army, which was consistently aligned with the United States, or with the leftist Pathet Lao. To American power brokers in 1955, Laos appeared to be a blank canvas. Unlike the chaotic and unsettled situation in South Vietnam, which was plagued by insurgency movements from the outset of their independence, Laos, with relative stability, appeared to be an open field for American influence. However, one major roadblock remained, and that was the Geneva Accords. According to the decision at Geneva, Laos was to be a neutral country, where foreign troops were strictly prohibited from entering. Although the French were allowed to keep a retinue of some 5,000 soldiers in their two modest military installations in the south, the country was largely off limits, other than insignificant allowances of foreign military advisors. Although the French were basically fully disengaged from Vietnam after Geneva, especially in 1956 when the war in Algeria started up, they remained significant players in interwar Laos for the time being. However, in the US's case, Geneva did not mandate any limits on foreign civilians in Laos. Critically, the US could ostensibly place as many agents in the country as they desired, if they were by international law considered civilian advisors. And of course, as we've come to see, CIA operators did technically count as civilians, especially when they operated under business cover. This is where the CIA's first forays into Lao covert action took shape. As it stood following the Geneva Conference and Laos's formal independence in 1954, the country would see 4 relatively quiet years. On the ground, outside of the semi-urban capital of Vientiane, Laos was and remains to this day a complex and ever-shifting combination of small fiefdoms and villages, comprising dozens of ethnicities and family hierarchies. Outside of the capital region, life continued as it always had, independently. A divide existed within Lao society between the lowland ethnic Lao farmers in the south and the rugged and diverse mountain tribesmen of the north. The southern Lao people, who were closely related to the Thais and who were overwhelmingly in control of the country's government and institutions, had for generations often regarded the mountain dwellers as simple and inferior, causing a stark political and cultural divide within the country. This chauvinistic attitude amongst the southern Laos caused further resentment and independence sentiment amongst the tribal people of the north, including, most critically, the Hmong people. For Prime Minister Souvanna Phouma, the first prime minister of the new Lao state, These challenges of ill-defined statehood, political division amongst three camps, and ethnic incoherence would bring consistent challenges to his government in their attempts to construct some sort of cohesive state structure for this amalgamation. Things remained quiet until mid-1958, when the country would be thrown into what has come to be known as the Laos Crisis. Before that period, between 1955 and 1958, the neutralist Souvanna government was attempting to juggle the different political forces in the country. The major issue was the integration of the Pathet Lao guerrilla movement, which had not been ordered to disarm at the Geneva Conference, into the Royal Lao Army. In November 1957, according to Peter Dale Scott, the Pathet Lao agreed to integrate their forces into the Lao Army, following an agreement reached between the Souvanna government and the Red Prince Supanuvong, which allowed the Pathet Lao to be recognized in the next election as a legal entity, and granted them 2 cabinet positions. Not long after, Prime Minister Souvanna began talks with the Pathet Lao, calling for a government of unity, working together to lead a coalition government. Alarm bells immediately went off across Washington, and the CIA was put on notice. You see, at this point, the Eisenhower administration had been supporting his government with massive amounts of aid, the majority of which was going to bolster the Royal Lao Army. According to Bernard Fall, writing about pre-1959 Laos, he claims that Laos was, quote, the only country in the world where the United States supports the military budget 100%, end quote. And Martin Stewart Fox continues by claiming that between 1955 and 1958, the US had given Laos over $120 million of aid, or, quote, about 4 times the amount the French had expended over the previous 8 years, end quote. Of course, this funding came with an often unstated but always implicit underlying condition, that Souvanna Phouma's neutralist government would take steps to exclude the Pathet Lao from the political process. Souvanna Phouma's approach to the communists, which was often conciliatory and collaborative, as he often refused to believe that his half-brother was in reality a communist, was not what the Eisenhower White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, or Langley had in mind. This would all come to a head in April 1958 for the special election, where the Lao crisis would really take shape. Alongside Washington's firm commitment in terms of financing the new state of Laos, they also had integrated a significant contingent of quote-unquote civilian advisors into the central state. Washington had 3 ostensibly civilian organizations working in Laos, which would continue to work in tandem throughout the next 2 decades to attempt to pull the new state into the Western fold. First to arrive in Laos, unsurprisingly, was the US State Department, opening an embassy in Vientiane in 1954 under Ambassador Charles Yost. In 1955, the CIA would also open shop, starting in a small bunkhouse in Vientiane. As Souvanna's government continued to flirt with the communist forces in the north in attempting to create a national unity government, CIA presence in the Keystone State would continue to grow accordingly. But, for the time being, from 1955 to 1958, the CIA worked almost exclusively on projects alongside their new dependable partner in Southeast Asia, the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. USAID missions provided the perfect cover for CIA and quote-unquote former military personnel to penetrate Laos's rugged countryside and to undertake activities that were otherwise disallowed under the Geneva Guidelines. Of course, USAID would also prove to be the CIA's primary partner in the maintenance of a secret mountain Hmong tribesman army starting in the mid-1960s, but that's still a ways away. In the mid-1950s, just after Laos was gaining its independence, USAID had yet to form a strong foothold in Laos. Instead, the country was host to a constellation of auxiliary USAID-funded missions that worked primarily and interestingly in the Jiangkwang province, home to the Plain of Jars, and home to Tubi Li Fung's Hmong community. Tubi Li Fung had proven to be the most outspoken and prominent political representative of the Hmong people during the French colonial era. Under his top lieutenant, the merciless Vang, Tubi Li Fung's Hmong Mccoy had fought alongside the French during the First Indochina War. Now, in 1956, the first American aid organization to find itself in Laos, known as the International Voluntary Services, or the IVS for short, which author Frederick Benson calls a precursor to the Peace Corps, was working on the Plain of Jars to assist the Hmong people with the goal, quote, to aid in the resettlement of a war-torn area by assisting and encouraging refugees and tribal people to seek a settled life, end quote. Not too surprisingly, those refugees and tribal people that were being prioritized by the USAID-funded IVS mission would end up forming the backbone of the CIA's secret army, the Hmong forces that would fight in the agency's first ever war. Also unsurprisingly, USAID would end up playing a vital role later in the 1960s in feeding the Hmong, so they could devote all their resources to two key areas of importance: fighting the secret war and growing their cash crop, opium. Alongside the IVS mission was a parallel CIA-funded aid mission called Operation Brotherhood. Starting in January 1957, Operation Brotherhood marked the first CIA incursions into the Plain of Jars, under the auspices of Filipino-staffed emergency hospitals to attend to the Hmong people in the region. It is interesting to note here the intersection once again of the CIA and Filipino assets, much like Edward Lansdale was employing in South Vietnam as No Dinh Diem's head of security. The Philippines, much like Thailand, would continue to prove to be useful allies within the Laos conflict. Now, the International Voluntary Services and Operation Brotherhood were therefore the CIA and USAID's first incursions into the ever-important Plain of Jars, where Vang Pau's army would regroup in the following decade, and where the agency would soon be posted during most of the secret war. It appears as well that Operation Brotherhood, in all respects a CIA front, also acted as a sort of recruitment tool at some level. In August 1959, CIA case officer Stuart Methvin would meet Vang Pao at an Operation Brotherhood hospital in Ban Ban, a town right outside of the Plain of Jars in north-central Laos. Although the CIA had been apprised of Vang Pao's existence since at least the end of the First Indochina War, Methvin's meeting with the future CIA client established a relationship that quickly evolved into a fully fledged rural outreach airdrop program later in the year. Vint Lawrence, a Laos CIA case officer, claimed in a 2006 interview that Stu Methvin was a, quote, catalyst for the whole thing, end quote. The whole thing here being, of course, the CIA relationship with the Hmong, which would continue to evolve throughout the 1960s. And as it would have it, Stu Methvin's first meeting with General Vang Pao in 1960 was through a USAID-associated mission, again showing the use of aid missions as a means to undertake otherwise disallowed intelligence work. These early CIA-USAID efforts in Laos would culminate in 1958's Operation Booster Shot, backdropped by Prime Minister Souvanna Phouma's announcement of nationwide special elections in the same year. As we enter the period of 1958 to 1960, I want to make clear that this 3-year period in Laos was marked by intense political shifts and numerous coups and counter-coups occurring in the capital of Vientiane. This period, leading up to the Laos Civil War in 1960, was especially complex. Now, I will try my best to untangle this political quagmire for you all today. But as a fair warning, we're going into some really shadowy territory, and it is difficult to really expand on everything. So I tried to streamline it, but again, there will be things that I will have to gloss over. As Washington was further frustrated by Souvanna Phouma's neutralist government and his constant attempts at reconciliation with the Pathet Lao, the Eisenhower administration dispatched the CIA and U.S. State Department to blatantly and consistently meddle in the Lao political process, and, more importantly, to attempt to place their chosen candidate in power. This was, after all, the U.S.'s chosen route to expanding their imperial reach across the globe during the Cold War. Unlike the overt colonialist powers of the past, which sought to impose absolute rule over their colonial holdings, the US took a different approach as the post-World War II superpower. By installing and supporting often anti-democratic, reactionary regimes in the critical states across the global south, Washington could ensure that a solid bulwark was built against the encroaching forces of socialism and nationalism that were surging after World War II. In so doing, local autonomy in these client states appeared on the surface to remain with the local people of the country, while in reality, standards of living usually remained stagnant and the states almost always aligned with Western interests. And with Souvanna Phouma, Laos's chosen prime minister, continually attempting to reconcile and unify his country, regardless of political aspirations, the US foreign policy apparatus decided that it was time for a consistently anti-democratic client in Laos, especially as the region became increasingly geopolitically significant, as I stated before. So as we are about to see, from 1958 to 1960, the CIA and the State Department literally molded Laos to its liking, imposing their chosen rulers by force and deception. And as we will see, these actions would lead to almost immediate blowback. So let's get into it. It all started in 1957. Washington's support of the neutralist Souvanna Phouma government began to waver as the neutralist leader made serious progress in establishing a unity government, in practice bringing Laos's three disparate political allegiances into one joint administration. The most critical roadblock to reaching this unity government before this point had been the integration of the Pathet Lao forces, which had not been ordered to disband after the Geneva Agreement, into the conventional armed forces of the Royal Lao Army. In 1957, Souvanna Phouma and his half-brother Supanu Vang, head of the Pathet Lao, made an agreement wherein the communist troops would integrate into the Lao army in return for official political representation for the Pathet Lao. The two parties agreed, and the Pathet Lao dropped their arms. And in turn, later that year, the process of integrating Pathet Lao forces into the army was well underway, as exemplified by the full reintegration of the two northern provinces of Sam Nua and Pong Sali by the Royal Lao Army. By New Year 1958, for the first time in its short history, Laos was a fully unified state entity. And American sentiment to this unification was expressed by Ambassador J. Graham Parsons, who, while testifying before a U.S. congressional committee, stated that he had, quote, struggled for 16 months to prevent a coalition, end quote. Remember, Washington was essentially covering the Lao government's entire budget during this period. They wanted a staunchly anti-communist ally along the lines of Thailand, and not some neutral state that worked with domestic communists. This marked the beginning of Washington's distrust and eventually full-on opposition to Prime Minister Souvanna Phouma. The 1958 Government of National Unity moved forward with their agreement, and as mandated, special elections were held in May of 1958, the first elections to allow Pathet Lao to run legally. According to Martin Stewart Fox, the major political issues amongst the Lao voter base during this election was American intervention and government corruption. Accordingly, the CIA launched their next major aid operation in the run-up to the critical election, as I stated earlier, titled Operation Booster Shot. Booster Shot was a massive undertaking, seeing the airdrop of some approximately 1,500 tons of supplies to the Pathet Lao strongholds in northern Laos. Booster Shot saw one of the first incursions of the CIA's proprietary Air Force, Civil Air Transport, into post-war Laos, to assist in the aid missions. From this early stage, it was already clear that the key to Laos was effective aviation logistics. The rugged terrain and thick jungle brush made it exceedingly difficult to direct operations through land. The most effective way to engage local populations and to enact operations was through the air, either to small dirt airstrips called Lima sites or by helicopter. Luckily for the CIA, they already had their own personal, ostensibly private airline, as I mentioned, Civil Air Transport, or CAT for short. CAT had already aided the CIA in their Operation Paper in Thailand, and had supported French efforts at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. CAT, which would soon be renamed to, of course, Air America in August 1959, would become the linchpin to CIA operations in Laos later in the 1960s. Again, effective aviation logistics was critical to nearly every major operation in the country. With Operation Booster Shot in full swing, and Langley awaiting anxiously the future results, the 1958 Laos special election was held, and has since been deemed surprisingly free and fair. This would be the last nominally democratic election in Laos's entire history. The election was held over 21 newly designated parliamentary seats, and overall, the leftist Pathet Lao won 9 seats, the neutralists won 4, and the right wing won 8. Emblematic in this outcome was the truly divided state of Laos during this period, but for Washington, this was a disappointing outcome, especially as the Pathet Lao cemented their place in a joint government, and proved that they did have broad popular support. Operation Booster Shot had been a failure, as foreign interference and the obviously cynical use of US aid to sway an election fed directly into Pathet Lao propaganda lines, especially in those targeted provinces in the north. It was time for some more overt means to affect Laos's political destiny. So you see, since Washington was fully funding the Royal Lao Army by this point, the US in turn controlled the livelihood of the government as an active entity. As without an army, the weak government in Vientiane could not hope to survive the instability in Laos. So, in theory, with the flip of a switch, the Americans could shut down the Lao administration at any time by cutting off the aid that they so desperately needed. And, in mid-1958, with the unfavorable election results representing the last straw to an already dissatisfied patron, the State Department, in essence, cut all aid to Laos. This line of thinking was expressed in a June 4th, 1958 telegram, only 1 month after the special election, from the US Embassy in Laos to the Department of State, where the sender claims, quote, "I am fully aware of the difficulties the department now has in justifying adequate appropriations for Laos. I consider the merger of conservative parties and formation of an anti-communist government now clearly must enjoy an even higher priority." End quote. Predictably, without US funding, Souvanna Phouma's neutralist unity government collapsed by late July of 1958, only 3 months after the election. Souvanna stepped down from the premiership, instead taking a position as the ambassador to France. In his place, former neutralist Foreign Secretary Phouy Sananacone stepped in. Phouy, avoiding the mistakes of his successor, immediately reverted the Lao political scene back to the pre-1957 state, once again banning the Pathet Lao and even going a step further and dismissing parliament. The new government stated in no uncertain terms that we are anti-communists, and the US, never opposed to working with undemocratic forces if they represented their interests, immediately resumed their aid packages, and Phouy's regime was allowed to persist. Following the establishment of Phouy's government and the banning of the Pathet Lao, the party's guerrilla forces, which had been partially integrated into the Royal Lao Army, scattered back out into the countryside, and the provinces in the north were once again captured by the disaffected leftist paramilitary. Prime Minister Phouy, rightfully fearing the beginning of a civil war, made the same mistake as his predecessor and once again began to open discussions of reconciliation with the Pathet Lao. At the close of 1958, the CIA and the Pentagon were already priming the Eisenhower White House for another coup in Laos. First, it was Director of the CIA Allen Dulles, on December 28th, who at a National Security Council meeting claimed that, quote, "drastic changes in Lao government will be required if the Pathet Lao element is to be restrained," end quote. And additionally, he stated, quote, "we have a great deal to fear in the 1959 general elections," end quote. According to historian Arthur Schlesinger, following the 1958 special election letdown and the disappointment with Phouy's conciliatory approach, the gloves came off and, quote, "Washington decided to install a reliably pro-Western regime. CIA spooks put in their appearance, set up a Committee for the Defense of the National Interest, or the CDNI for short, and brought back from France as its chief an energetic, ambitious, and devious officer named Phoumy Nosavan. Future General Phoumy, not to be confused with Phouy, I understand this is a bit confusing. So Phoumy, who had been discovered by CIA agent Jack Hasey, studying at a French war college in France in 1957, was thus flown back into Vientiane. There, back in Laos, CIA Station Chief Henry Heckscher helped Phoumy form a coup group, or simply a military junta, under the CDNI, which was essentially a quasi-secret political organization made up of right-wing generals in the Royal Lao Army, ready to take power at the CIA's notice. I do want to note really quickly that it was probably no coincidence that Henry Heckscher was brought into Vientiane in 1958 and 59. Heckscher himself was an OSS CIA old boy, having started his post-war CIA career as head of counterintelligence in Berlin, a very prestigious role at a critical intelligence hotspot. There, he worked alongside future Laos station chief and secret team operator Ted Shackley, working in his first agency role as well in West Germany. Heckscher was later also instrumental in the 1954 coup in Guatemala, Operation PB Success. So, by this point in 1958, Heckscher seemed like a perfect fit for another coup in Laos. Anyways, returning to 1959 Laos. The CDNI's Phumi Nosavan was not chosen randomly. The imported general was actually the nephew of Thai strongman leader and staunch US ally Sarit Thanarat. Given the close ties between Thailand and Laos, and Langley's general favorability of Sarit's unwavering anti-communism and subservience to American interests, having this familial connection between both governments was definitely viewed as a significant benefit. Although 1959 was an election year, General Phumi, the CIA's chosen candidate, was no politician, and the agency figured correctly that it was unlikely that the Lao people would rally behind a nakedly corrupt military dictator without proper pretenses. So, the CIA began to create a suitable environment for their general's rise. It started in March of 1959, when the CIA installed KMT guerrillas, the ones they had supplied in the early 1950s under Operation Paper, in eastern Burma, crossed over into western Laos, allegedly supplied by civil air transport planes. This new force in Laos caught the government in Vientiane off guard, forcing Prime Minister Phumi to order his already overextended army to defend the previously unguarded western border. This marked the beginning of Laos's conflict along the formerly quiet western border. These conflicts would continue throughout the 1960s. As clashes intensified in the west, the eastern border was left vulnerable, and over the summer, Pathet Lao and Viet Minh guerrillas began to ramp up their activities along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was really the birth of the trail as we know it, and it would really not stop until the end of the Vietnam War. This intensifying action along the trail led to what was dubbed the, quote, invasion crisis in the Western press, as journalists such as Joseph Alsop published some of the first stories about Laos in American newspapers. The Laos crisis was taking on an international dimension, beginning to be primed for middle American audiences. Joseph Alsop, for his part, maybe the most preeminent Western mouthpiece for the Laos conflict, had worked as an embedded journalist with Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers during World War II, the predecessor to Civil Air Transport and Air America, of course the CIA's airlines in Laos. Alsop had also worked in the past on assignment for the CIA, working as an embedded journalist at their request. It seemed that Alsop's appearance at Sam Nua province in northern Laos, just in time for the Pathet Lao and Viet Minh to begin their marches southward along the newly formed Ho Chi Minh Trail, was more than a coincidence. Alsop, a true insider in the CIA Old Boys Circle in Georgetown, had probably been tipped by the CIA and told to cover the evolving story. On screen now you can actually see two photos of Alsop in Sam Nua province in 1959, one of which he is identified as speaking with General Juan Radicone. At the time in 1959, Radicone was relatively unknown, but in the mid-1960s, he would become the main Lao army officer in charge of opium production and exports in the country. Alsop's chance meeting with such prominent figures in the future CIA narco-complex is eyebrow-raising to say the least, and his early and coincidental trip to Laos illuminates the use of embedded journalists by intelligence agencies to construct a favorable narrative. Coincidentally, 1959 also saw the first incursions of the CIA's newly renamed airline, Air America, into Laos, as two of the first Air America transport planes landed in Vientiane during this period, according to an August 23, 1959 New York Times article. It has been speculated that these planes were secretly delivering military equipment to General Phumi's coup forces, as Air America planes would continue to play a critical role in supplying not only Phumi's forces, but all CIA-supported troops in Laos throughout the conflict. So, accordingly, as stated by Peter Dale Scott, on December 30th, 1959, the CIA gave the go-ahead for CDNI General Phumi Nosavan to march his troops into Vientiane, and within days, he was in control of the capital in a bloodless coup. The successful and altogether pretty seamless operation would lead Laos down an inevitable path towards civil war. Although Phumi finally had control of the capital following 2 tumultuous years, the rest of Laos was in total disarray, as I'm sure you can all imagine. In 1958 and 59 alone, the country, that was not even 5 years old, had seen 3 administrations, only one of which had been legitimately voted in. The Lao people had witnessed 1 soft coup and 1 full-blown military coup, both of which had been heavily instigated by foreign meddling. 2 of the major political factions, the neutralists and the communists, had been forced out of the political arena, and the country was hanging by a thread, as violence picked up along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the east, and KMT breakaway paramilitaries in the west continued to threaten the border. So, when in April 1960, the CIA helped rig an election to give Phouma some sense of legitimacy, it predictably did not go over well with the majority of the population. Now, to put it clearly, this election was not simply rigged, it was laughably illegitimate. In Sam Nua province, for example, which I'll remind you was the communist stronghold in the past 3 elections, the Pathet Lao lost their seat in parliament. But they did not just lose their seat, they were absolutely obliterated, losing with only a total of 13 votes cast in their favor, comparatively to the winner's 6,508 votes. This whole election had been thoroughly fixed by both the Royal Lao Army under Phouma's control and the CIA, of course. According to Arthur Doman in his book Conflict in Laos, quote, CIA agents participated in the election rigging, with or without the authority of the American ambassador. A Foreign Service officer flatly told an observer in Souvanna, which by the way I'll remind you was General Phouma's hometown, that, quote, prior to the voting, he had seen CIA agents distribute bagfuls of money to village headmen. The inescapable conclusion was that the United States had been buying votes, end quote. With such flagrant and undeniable fraud taking place in the April 1960 election, resistance was inevitable. And that resistance to the CIA-installed Phouma regime came very soon in the form of a little-known neutralist Lao captain named Kong Le. When Kong Le successfully marched his troops into Vientiane on August 9, 1960, he was relatively unknown amongst his countrymen. Captain Kong Le, a neutralist, populist, anti-corruption paratrooper captain who, somewhat ironically, had actually been trained by US Special Forces a year prior, had simply marched his paratrooper battalion into Vientiane, on a day where General Phouma and the other CDNI members were away at Luang Prabang, the royal capital, to speak with the king. Kong Le, the coup leader's demands were simple. He wanted an end to corruption and an end to foreign interference in his country, and, finally, to reinstate former neutralist Prime Minister Souvanna Phouma to the premiership. He stated later, quote, American aid had corrupted many government officials. The goal of US aid was good, but the program created too many opportunities for corruption. It had to be stopped, end quote. Another account claimed that Kong Le's main ethos could be boiled down to the simple mantra, why should Lao fight Lao? On that note, Kong Le reinstalled the once disgraced neutralist Prime Minister Souvanna Phouma, and for a few months he would rule Laos once again. Souvanna, as always, proposed the formation of a government of national unity, aiming to end the civil war by creating a government that would include representatives from both the right and the left. This plan was apparently on the verge of success when, as Alfred Mccoy stated, the CIA-supported Phouma suddenly broke off from negotiations in early September and returned to his home in Souvanna on the Thai-Lao border, where he announced the formation of the Revolutionary Committee, end quote. Once again, reconciliation in Laos was thwarted. The CIA, however, showed their support of General Phouma's stand as always, and Air America planes almost immediately began landing in Souvanna from Bangkok. And by November, the CIA's general had once again built up a force strong enough to march to Vientiane. And of course, by December 1960, as had become the norm in Laos by this point, after 3 days of street fighting in Vientiane, Kong Le and his forces were forced to retreat, and once again, Langley's chosen strongman was in charge of the capital, and rightist Prince Boon was installed as prime minister. As a reward for his tenacity, Phouma was made defense minister, and ultimately held the true power in the new administration. Now, Washington had their man in Laos, but at what cost? Although Kong Le may have been overly idealistic and unprepared, he was by no means wrong in his assessment and starry-eyed vision of a Lao state committed to anti-corruption. The endless flow of foreign funds that had been circulating the impoverished country mostly went to lining the pockets of a select few bureaucrats and generals in the capital. The Royal Lao Army, which was the intended recipient of the majority of American foreign aid, remained a lackluster and undisciplined force, as exemplified by the ease and simplicity of the string of coups between 1958 and 1960 in the country. If a minor army officer like Kong Le could seize the Lao capital in a coup, it was clear that the army was in serious disarray. And evidently, the United States felt the same way about the capability of the Royal Lao Army, as starting in about 1959, right in the midst of the political turmoil sweeping the country, The CIA and the Pentagon had quietly begun to ramp up their paramilitary and counterinsurgency training programs throughout Laos. This training would all increase exponentially, as the country would be thrown into civil war, first sparked by Phouma Nosavan's re-entry into Vientiane in December 1960, and ultimately lasting until 1975. Although Souvanna Phouma, the neutralist, would eventually be reinstated as prime minister in 1962, and would remain in power for most of the Civil War, his office had been diminished, and the major levers of power in Vientiane would remain with the US's main stated ally in the country, the Royal Lao Army. After 1960, the prospect of democratic political pluralism had been all but quashed. Laos's army, under General Phouma Nosavan, would continue to fall deeper into corrupt ineffectiveness, as the army endlessly struggled with troop morale, and Phouma and his officers continued to participate in and largely facilitated the opium trade, as a way to keep their forces active during short periods of wavering US support, most notably in 1962 under President Kennedy. Phouma would eventually assign this covert opium funding model to his subordinate, General Juan Radicone, a future CIA ally who would become a major sponsor of heroin refineries across Laos's western border. Now, we will discuss General Juan much more extensively in future episodes, but for now, in an interview he gave with Alfred Mccoy in the early 1970s, General Juan Radicone admitted that his boss Phouma's opium profits in the early date of 1962, mind you very early in the Secret War, totaled at least $35,000 a month. Even in these early stages, everyone was dipping their toes into the lucrative opium trade. Already in 1960, Laos was intrinsically divided and would remain as such for the rest of the decade. With roaming leftist Pathet Lao guerrillas in the northern provinces, North Vietnamese convoys moving down south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and continuously swelling border clashes with Burmese irregulars in the west, Laos was quite literally bursting at the seams. The CIA-backed generals held control of the southwest out of Souvanna along the Thai border, and at times out of Vientiane. And the rest of the country, well, as Alfred Mccoy puts it, quote, everything in between was virtually autonomous, and all three factions competed for territory and influence in the undeclared provinces, end quote. And right in the middle of this, quote, virtually autonomous in-between region was the Plain of Jars. Named for its massive jar-shaped rock structures of unknown origin, the Plain of Jars in the Jiangkwang province in central northern Laos would be the centerpiece of the future Secret War. Housing the majority of the Hmong refugees from the ongoing conflicts in the region, and serving as the meeting point between the three historic trade routes crisscrossing Laos, the Plain of Jars would serve not only as the main opium-producing region for the future Secret Army, the center of the Golden Triangle, the logistical nerve center of the CIA's operations in the country, but also the main target of the unspeakable bombing campaign that would intensify in the last years of the 1960s and into the early 70s. But for now, in 1960, the plain remained relatively quiet, mostly occupied by mountain tribespeople, attended to by US aid missions, and a few disparate foreign spooks and paramilitary advisors. Things were about to get much busier on the Plain of Jars. With the Laos Civil War in full swing by mid-1960, we also find ourselves right back where I decided to start this whole mini-series on Laos, with outgoing President Eisenhower's foreign policy meetings with President-elect John Kennedy before his inauguration in early 1961. Throughout these meetings, Eisenhower famously warned Kennedy specifically about Laos, saying that the biggest risk of communist gains was in the small, relatively unknown, landlocked country. Now, as we've slowly gotten back to this point, maybe you better understand now why Eisenhower was so worried about Laos, given that the country was embroiled in a near constant state of turmoil and infighting. In 1961, the risk of the early Laos Civil War expanding and spilling over into a region-wide war was top of mind in the national security blob. And in a sense, the escalating situation in Laos did directly contribute to the war in Vietnam, as Langley and the State Department's continued inability to coerce Laos's leadership into falling in line with their foreign policy agenda would inevitably bring on the escalating counterinsurgency crisis in the Republic of South Vietnam. But even beyond that, Eisenhower, or at the very least his advisors, may have understood at some level that Lao opium was seriously beginning to contribute to the unaccountable budgets of the two major US client states in the region. Thailand, and South Vietnam, as we covered in previous videos on this channel. Not to mention, with the ascension of General Phouma in 1960 as defense minister in Laos, their army would soon enough also be bolstered by the profitable narco trade. In turn, if the Pathet Lao would succeed in northern Laos, where the opium was grown, then it would likely deal a major blow to the finances of both of the pro-American regimes in Bangkok and Saigon, and also, eventually, the regime in Laos. These regimes, of course, representing the major bulwarks against the tide of socialism in the subcontinent, and Washington's imperialist efforts in the region. And by the time Kennedy took office on January 21st, 1961, the CIA themselves were already hard at work instrumentalizing their own private secret army in the north of Laos, amongst the Hmong people on the plains of Jars. So, finally, with all the pieces in place, let's discuss the CIA's early paramilitary operations in Laos, and begin to explore how, throughout the 1960s, the agency evolved from spycraft to warcraft in the small keystone state of Laos. Langley's first paramilitary and counterinsurgency operations in Laos largely grew out of the CIA's active missions in the northern Thai borderlands, which had been operational since as early as 1950. As I covered previously in other videos, in the early 1950s, the CIA had helped arm and train the Thai Border Patrol, a police paramilitary counterinsurgency force under the notoriously corrupt Thai police chief General Pao Sihanouk. According to several researchers, General Pao's border police were deeply invested in the north-south opium trade from the poppy-rich Shan state of Burma to the dens in Bangkok, working as a middleman between both nodes. As this blatant corruption continued, Washington also proceeded to increase their military assistance to the Thai state, with U.S. aid increasing from $4.5 million in 1951 to $56 million in 1953. As Pao's CIA forces quashed the insurgency movements in northern Thailand, the force would slowly begin to conduct cross-border raids into neighboring northwestern Laos. A key advisor on these operations, from 1951 at its inception to 1958, was Oklahoma-born, Texas-raised CIA officer James William Lair, known better by his name Bill Lair. And Bill Lair would go on to head the first class of men, who I'll be referring to as the Laos Cowboys. These CIA operators presented a stark departure from the founding class of CIA spies, which were mostly from the upper-crust elite-born spooks of the early OSS, who would go on to direct the early CIA. The Georgetown set, as they're often referred to, or otherwise known as the Old Boys Network, here referring to the Alan Dulleses, the Richard Helmses, and the James Jesus Angletons of the CIA. These Ivy League graduates and longtime members of the Old Boys Club were truly immersed in our ideal concept of spycraft. Scheming, cloak and dagger, Machiavellian planning, orchestrating coups, placing informants and moles, and generally the art of deception. Now, underneath them, throughout the first years of the agency, emerged a second class of spies, which I have referred to as the operators. These were the ones to conduct the dirty work of intelligence. In other words, actually undertaking the criminal elements inherent in the Old Boys plot. These were usually former law enforcement agents, or, even better, men out of the private intelligence world. But in contrast to their bespoke, suit-wearing lawyer and business executive bosses, and their rough-around-the-edges former law enforcement operators, was a new class of intelligence operatives emerging. The Laos Cowboys represented a growing class of CIA agents that were less focused on the conventional art of spycraft. Instead, they were to expand the scope of the CIA away from typical covert operations towards fully fledged paramilitary work, usually reserved for Army Special Forces trainers. These new CIA men were usually not from the elite world of the Northeast, nor from the law enforcement world of the operators, but instead coming out of Middle America, often from either Army intelligence background or high-flying OSS work during the war. Also, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, the CIA would start to draw upon a new pool of paramilitary experts within the Cuban exile groups they had armed and trained during both the failed invasion of Cuba and under Operation Mongoose, the umbrella term for the Castro assassination program. I like to view these Cuban exiles as the contract workers of the CIA, being an available pool of unaccountable operatives that had significant experience in both guerrilla combat and in training insurgents. I do want to give this topic a much deeper dive later down the line, especially as Ted Shackley will enter our picture in Laos later. Shockley was brought to Laos because of his work as the head of the JM Wave CIA station in Miami, heading the Cuban exile recruitment and training programs, as we'll see later. We will get to all this sometime in the future, but for now, I would be remiss if I did not mention the critical Cuban exile component within CIA paramilitary circles. And one of the first members of this new class of CIA paramilitary experts was none other than Bill Lair. Although relatively tame compared to his future peers in Laos, Lair was by all accounts a true paramilitary expert, and the first of our Laos Cowboys. Lair was by all accounts a stoic operator, which made him an immediate favorite in early 1950s Bangkok, where stoicism and coolness are fundamental social norms. During his nearly decades-long tour there, Lair would help develop specifically the Thai Border Patrol's Police Parachute Aerial Reinforcement Unit, or PARU for short, a paratrooper unit within the paramilitary structure under Police General Pao. The PARU was unique, as it represented a semi-private independent element within the Thai Border Patrol structure. PARU was run almost exclusively by the CIA, trained by Bill Lair and his associates, and funded through CIA back channels. Lair oversaw the opening of a private paramilitary school in Hua Hin, Thailand, where in 1958, the trainees were being taught in the dark arts of counterinsurgency, and apparently, as part of their training, being dropped into insurgent territory to fight, predictably in Laos. In an interview Bill Lair gave later in life to Texas Tech University for their Vietnam Center, he actually claimed that in 1953, then CIA Director Allen Dulles had made a short trip to his jungle training center in rural Thailand. Lair claimed that Dulles was mightily impressed by his paramilitary facility, and that this short and opportune visit by the director would later help Lair head up the secret training program in Laos during the early Kennedy administration. Additionally, Timothy Neal Castle, in his dissertation, At War in the Shadows of Vietnam, calls Bill Lair's PARU, quote, arguably Thailand's most versatile fighting force, end quote. Lair's operations in Thailand were funded by the infamous Sea Supply Company, a CIA cutout firm founded by a Miami-based lawyer and CIA paymaster Paul Helliwell. Paul Helliwell, as I have covered extensively on this channel, was the founder of the CIA narco-complex during his early work with the OSS in China during World War II. Now, Helliwell's Sea Supply Company, which had Bill Lair officially on the payroll, served as a front company, disbursing some $35 million a year of aid to Pao's corrupt police force. But PARU specifically, and its independent nature as a distinct force within the Thai Border Patrol, remains interesting, as Lair's paratrooper unit, although officially funded by the CIA, to an outside observer appeared to be an independent mercenary force funded by the mysterious Sea Supply Corp. In turn, the CIA's early work with Lair would inspire his future work in setting up the Hmong fighting force in Laos to circumvent the mandated neutrality in the country. Bill Lair's CIA-backed program represented the beginning of a gradual shift within the agency, which started largely in Laos and would reach a climactic peak with Iran-Contra in the 1980s. The agency was beginning to perfect a complex system of plausible deniability by masking agency and thus US government implication in illegal covert activity through the use of shell companies known as proprietaries that acted as middlemen between the CIA and the operators on the ground. The use of shell companies by the CIA in 1959, when Bill Lair would move to Laos, was by no means a new practice. Sea Supply Corp, for example, had actually been founded by CIA paymaster Paul Helliwell, under the umbrella of the shadowy World Commerce Corporation. The World Commerce Corporation had been founded by former OSS director Wild Bill Donovan, who himself was in a sense the first CIA cowboy. So the structure existed before the Secret War, but after Laos, the privatized CIA, if you will, would become institutionalized and integrated into the very practice of US intelligence by the very men who undertook the Secret War. This type of cover was required in Laos, as technically, all this paramilitary work, training the Hmong secret army, providing them weapons and planes, and of course the whole narco element, were illegal, not only by international law, but also partially illegal by domestic US law. Additionally, securing congressional funding to cover a full-blown secret war proved impossible, as even requesting funding would in turn bring with it further scrutiny. So once the mask of private intelligence was developed in the latter half of the war, The agency never stopped using these types of financial networks to firstly mask their operations, but secondly fund their unapproved operations through narco-trafficking, gun running, and other untraceable activities. Finally, and maybe most predictably, this type of off-the-books intelligence work would open the door for massive personal profiteering by key agents, leading to an additional selfish motivation and corrupt self-interest within many future operations. Of course, we will get much more into this later into this series, but for the time being, Bill Lair's Sea Supply Corp funded private paramilitary work in Thailand was at the cutting edge of the CIA's program, and the agency wanted to expand such work into the fracturing country of Laos. Into the late 1950s, Lair would come to hear rumors circling the Bangkok CIA station and amongst his commandos that in the newly independent country of Laos in the north, there were mountain tribespeople that were simply awaiting supplies and arms to take up weapons against their communist neighbors. Rumors also spread across CIA circles in Southeast Asia, as veteran Hmong commandos from the First Indochina War and their leader Vang were showing up at US aid and CIA-funded hospitals outside the Plain of Jars. It was also suggested by CIA agent Vint Lawrence, a former CIA paramilitary officer in Laos at the time, that one Stu Methvin was the one to raise Bill Lair's attention to Vang Pau's Hmong army. Vint stated in an interview, quote, "And I think Methvin and or Fosmir, or both, sent the word to Lair, cause Lair was, at that point, really not involved. You'd better meet this guy Vang Pao, they said, cause he's impressive. He's got his people together. He's trying to form a resistance group and they're using old flintlock rifles. And whatever." I think the first meeting between Vang Pao and Lair is probably set up by Methvin. Methvin, I'll remind you, was the CIA agent that met Vang Pao at the US aid hospital on the Plain of Jars. As the CIA men arrived in the rugged jungles of Laos, they were happy to find that they were not starting from zero. Well before the CIA's first forays into paramilitary work in Laos, the US Army Special Forces had already made substantial efforts to bolster the capabilities of the always incompetent and undisciplined Royal Lao Army. So in July 1959, just as the Pathet Lao were returning to Samnua in the north, the US Army launched Project White Star, which also went by several other names such as Project Hotfoot and Operation Ambidextrous. In circumvention of the Geneva Conference's Declaration on Lao Neutrality, U.S. Special Forces operatives dressed in civilian clothing and officially assigned under the civilian cover of the National Geodetic Society Survey Association trained irregular forces in the rural villages of Laos in an attempt to bolster local resistance to the armed Pathet Lao. Project White Star represented a significant escalation in U.S. involvement in Laos, as this was the first independent program that saw U.S. trainers working directly and independently with Lao forces. When the U.S. began paramilitary training in Laos, the Green Beret teams immediately realized that there was a fundamental problem amongst the majority of the recruits into the Laos armed forces. They had no idea what they were fighting for or what they were defending against. According to Annie Jacobsen, in her book Surprise, Kill, Vanish, quote, "Most of the White Star trainees were illiterate, and many did not know that Laos was an independent nation, or that it possessed a standing army," end quote. And, quote, "White Star advisors faced an almost insurmountable task in trying to instill a sense of urgency and purpose in the Laotian soldiers to implement a rigid training schedule," end quote. Nonetheless, in 1959 and 1960, White Star continued to attempt to construct a viable army in the nebulous Laos state. According to Neil Castle, the White Star project saw a relatively small contingent of about 150 advisors divided amongst 12 teams within the Lao armed forces. Eventually, White Star teams, quote, "were also engaged in training irregular forces to carry out guerrilla and anti-guerrilla operations. These were likely the Hmong forces of Vang Pao." Interestingly, and maybe somewhat ironically, it was under the White Star program that Captain Kong Le was trained, the neutralist officer who would overthrow CIA client Phouma Nausavan in 1960. This event, if any, proved that White Star efforts continued to prove ineffective in creating a Lao army subordinate to US interests. In late 1960 and early 1961, priorities were to shift, as the CIA entered the picture and new clients emerged in Laos, the Hmong. As President Kennedy entered the White House after a historically close victory over Vice President Richard Nixon, he initially followed the advice of his hawkish advisors across the globe. In February 1961, just as the young president was beginning his first and only term, the French withdrew completely from Laos, unofficially passing the torch to the Americans. A few months earlier, in late 1960, Bill Lair and his CIA paramilitary training team, alongside some of their Thai PARU commandos, relocated to Laos in the southern town of Souvanna, hometown to General Phouma and a strategic location right on the Thai-Lao border. There, according to Lair himself, they aided General Phouma in reclaiming Laos from Captain Kong Le and helped his forces with the Battle of Vientiane. Once the CIA's chosen General Phouma was in control in Vientiane, Bill Lair got to work courting other potential fighting forces. This period in early 1961 was when Bill Lair first came into contact with Vang. In his own words, during his first meeting with Vang in January 1961, he told the Hmong commander, quote, "We can't live with the communists. Either we fight the communists or we gotta get out of Thailand," end quote. In that moment, the CIA got the response that they would continue to get from the young Hmong prodigy, a response that would continue to please them. He told Lair, quote, "You give us the weapons and we'll fight the communists," end quote. To the CIA, who had been continuously frustrated with the inaction of the Royal Lao Army, the response from the Hmong commander must have felt like a breath of fresh air. Immediately, Bill Lair left for Vientiane and got a meeting with Desmond Fitzgerald, the chief of the Far East Division of the CIA. Fitzgerald had been a longtime CIA agent and an entrenched member of the Old Boys Network. Lair notes that Fitzgerald was good friends with both CIA Director Allen Dulles and Wild Bill Donovan, the former director of the wartime intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services. Desmond Fitzgerald would also serve as Deputy Director of Plans for 2 years during the height of the secret war in Laos, between 1965 and 1967, the critical period where Ted Shackley would be running the shop there. Although Bill Lair and Desmond Fitzgerald had never met before, he told Lair to draft a cable to send to Langley. The 18-page memo was then circulated to the highest office in the CIA, to Allen Dulles' desk, where Fitzgerald had recommended to go along with the proposal. And just like that, in a, quote, very short time, a response came back from the center, stating, quote, "We will authorize it to go ahead and arm the first 1,000 men, and then we'll see how that goes, and we'll look into other things after that." That short authorization from CIA Director Allen Dulles, who was soon to be disgraced following the Bay of Pigs, was enough to launch Operation Momentum, the nearly decade-long CIA program that would arm and train an army of approximately 40,000 Hmong guerrilla fighters to fight the secret war in Laos. And from there was truly no turning back. In accordance with the CIA and the China lobby in Washington, D.C. that filled his early administration and had his ear, in the first months of the Kennedy presidency, his administration appeared to be taking a hard line on Laos. On March 23, 1961, President Kennedy hosted a live television news conference regarding Laos. To most Americans, this would have been one of the first times that they would ever hear of the obscure Southeast Asian state. Most of the international attention had been pointed to the US's ongoing struggles in bolstering their partner regime in South Vietnam. Laos, which had primarily been a French concern, at least officially, had been barely reported on in the American press. Kennedy sternly told the US public, quote, "Laos is far away from America, but the world is small. Its 2 million people live in a country 3 times the size of Austria. The security of all of Southeast Asia will be endangered if Laos loses its neutral independence. Its own safety runs with the safety of us all, in real neutrality observed by all. I want to make it clear to the American people and to all of the world that all we want in Laos is peace, not war, a truly neutral government, not a Cold War pawn, a settlement concluded at the conference table and not on the battlefield," end quote. Although his message was one of supporting Lao neutrality, in the background, during the first 2 months of Kennedy's time in office, he had ramped up U.S. Air Force activities over Laos. Some scholars even go so far as to argue that Kennedy's March 23rd press conference was actually prepping the U.S. public for an official intervention in Laos. Coincidentally, on the exact same day as his press conference, on March 23rd, a U.S. Air Force badged, quote, specially configured SC-47 reconnaissance aircraft, codenamed Rose Bowl, had been shot down over Laos. The whole crew died on impact, other than a U.S. Army attaché, one Major Lawrence Bailey. The Rose Bowl disaster, coming right in the wake of the Kennedy Conference, brought international scrutiny to his neutrality stance. Yet the president did not waver. In late March 1961, about a dozen unmarked U.S. B-26 bombers, flown by Air America pilots and former active U.S. Air Force pilots, landed in Takli, Thailand, about 120 miles north of Bangkok, poised for bombing runs of Laos. Leading the mission was one Air Force Major Harry C. Heine Aderholt. Heine Aderholt would spend the next decade or so advising the CIA on their covert air war in Laos. Aderholt is also credited as the man who invented the Lima site, the short dirt runway used throughout Laos for Air America planes to land and drop off shipments of weapons for the Hmong. Of course, these Lima sites would also be ideal for loading freshly harvested opium en route to the refineries. Alongside the establishment and construction of Lima sites, Major Aderholt had been put in charge of Operation Millpond, the top-secret Air Force operation approved by the Kennedy White House, that was to see the first bombs dropped on Laos. And on April 16, 1961, Operation Millpond pilots were given unofficial status in the Royal Lao Air Force, and were told that they were to begin the bombing of the Plain of Jars the next morning. And then, suddenly, on April 17, 1961, the very next day,
the assault has begun on the dictatorship of Fidel Castro.
The bombing orders were abruptly cancelled. The planes remained grounded, and Operation Millpond would never fly over Laos, or drop a single bomb. The cancellation of Operation Millpond happened on April 17, 1961, the exact date of the first day of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. Up to this point, Kennedy had implicitly trusted his national security advisors, and more crucially the CIA, and followed their direction blindly. But the agency's deception at the Bay of Pigs would taint the Kennedy administration's view of the decision-makers around him and their motives, especially the case for the CIA, which he would continue to view with high skepticism and would continue to try and largely fail to reel in throughout his short presidency. This would include, of course, the firing of Allen Dulles and the deputy director of plans under him, Richard Bissell, who was largely in charge of the Bay of Pigs invasion. As for Laos, I believe that Kennedy speechwriter and advisor Ted Sorensen put it best. Quote, "That operation, the Bay of Pigs, had been recommended principally by the same set of advisors who'd favored intervention in Laos. But now, the president was far more skeptical of the experts, their reputations, their recommendations. He relied more on his White House staff and his own common sense." End quote. So just like that, the bombing of Laos had been delayed, largely due to circumstances that were outside of the purview of the ongoing civil war. It would take the Johnson administration to restart that bombing. So from that day on, April 17, 1961, the Kennedy administration would continue to attempt to de-escalate the situation in Laos, pushing for a diplomatic settlement, avoiding further confrontation. And all of this would culminate on July 23, 1962, over a year later. Kennedy would finally achieve that diplomatic settlement, when 14 states, most crucially the US, France, both Vietnams, the Soviet Union, and China, reconvened in Geneva to sign a new agreement on the neutrality of Laos. The agreement sought to avoid a potential superpower confrontation in the Keystone State. Once again, in mid-1962, an agreement was signed asserting that Laos was to be left alone by the international community. This would be the case for both the Soviet Union and the conventional armed forces of the US, as both countries would disengage from Laos on the surface. But as soon would be made clear, the diplomatic road had long been exhausted, as North Vietnam and the CIA continued to operate in Laos completely unfettered by the 1962 agreement. To the intelligence community, the new declaration of neutrality in Laos was a gift in disguise, as it essentially handed the country and the ongoing conflict there solely to their domain. In 1962, Laos was handed to the CIA, and Operation Momentum started to run full swing. The secret war was online. Thank you all for watching, and please, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and comment down below, letting me know what you thought. As always, it helps greatly with the algorithm. The video you watched today first aired on my Patreon to my subscribers on April 24th, 2024. I would not have been able to dedicate the time and effort away from friends and family producing this video without their generous support. On screen now are the names of my producer tier patrons. As you know, when you watch Eyes Wide Open on YouTube, it is always ad-free. I do not make any money off of YouTube ads, which allows me to say what I want and not worry about keeping my content within the confines of YouTube's stringent monetization policy. That said, I'm completely dependent on individual support to do the work that I do. So to my patrons, thank you. I can't believe it, but we are already halfway through Season 2 of Eyes Wide Open. But what if I told you that the best is yet to come? For now, we are going to put a pause on the Secret War in Laos series to reset the timeline back to the mid-40s with the first part of my War Conspiracy series. Now, do not worry if you've been enjoying this Laos series. I will be returning to the Secret War there midway through 2025, and that's going to be the real crux of the Secret War. But first, I have shifted my attention to two threads that need to be covered first to get the full story of the Laos operations. The first of these two threads that we're going to be covering in the second half of Season 2, which I've actually seen many of you state in the comments below, so I'm glad that many of you are on the same page with this, and that being the military-industrial complex, which we will start diving into next week and the week after with the first two parts of the War Conspiracy series. Named after Peter Dale Scott's iconic book of the same name, in these videos I dive into the pro-war quagmire to track the origins of the military-industrial complex and the lobbying groups that ultimately swayed the country into Vietnam and also back into Laos in 1964 after the assassination of JFK. I actually plan to return to this series with the third part soon on Patreon. That'll probably be at the end of 2024 or early 2025 with a deep dive into Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, and their ties to General Dynamics amongst other firms. So that'll close off the War Conspiracy, but for now, we get two parts. After those two videos, I focus heavily on the Cuba show and the CIA anti-Castro operations of the late 50s and early 60s, one of my personal favorite sort of milieus of CIA activity. This is a personal passion of mine. I've read so much about Cuba, and I keep reading so much about Cuba, so I'm really excited to share this. As I will show later on, many of the CIA officers and staff members that cut their teeth in the secret war against Castro would then be shipped off to Laos later to help develop the agency's paramilitary capabilities there in the mid-60s. Most notably is Ted Shackley, otherwise known as the Blonde Ghost, a man that I am actually presently covering in the newest video hitting Patreon later this month and into December of this year. That's going to be the videos focusing on a JM Wave station in Miami in the post-Bay of Pigs era, and then finally my videos on Louisiana and sort of the build-up towards the JFK assassination. In sum, to understand the CIA's operations in Laos in the mid-60s, we need to first look at the evolution of the agency in the Gulf of Mexico in the late 50s and early 60s. Many of the developments there would be brought over to the Keystone State in Southeast Asia half a decade later. I can't wait to share both the War Conspiracy series and the Cuba series with you in the upcoming weeks. If you are watching this video later, say in late 2024 or early 2025, these videos are already released. You can watch them now. I hope you enjoy them. What I will say is that these upcoming videos are some of my proudest and most richly researched videos yet. So again, I really can't wait to show it to you guys. But until then, if you wish to support my independent documentary filmmaking, please consider checking out my Patreon link below. The 5 remaining videos that will be premiering weekly on this channel over the rest of 2024 and the most recent series I made on George H.W. Bush are available there now if you wish to binge them all. But that's all I've got for today, folks. But thank you so much for watching as always. We'll be back again next Friday with another video. But remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.